Hi, everybody. We're in Born in the Year of Courage, and we're on chapter 5, A Ship. According to Fudonojo's marks on the driftwood, they were in the 6th month on the island. Toraman continued to help look for food, but he seemed to have given up hope that they would be rescued. Only Menjiro went each day to watch for a ship. He went to his post with morning's first light because it was cooler then. The climbing walk did not make him as thirsty or tax his strength as much as he would if he waited until the sun beat down upon the rocks. This day he watched the sun rise and trim white clouds streak with gold, then dissolve the clouds as it inched up in the sky. The sea was serene. It reflected the sky's deepening blue. Menjiro squinted and shook his head. Was he imagining things, or did he see fountains of water spurting up? Yes, whales. He started to rise and go tell the others, and then stopped. Why? Why waste his energy? What did whales here mean? At home, a fisherman who spotted, and they give the word for it, kujira, would have rowed swiftly back toward shore and shouted the news. Then, amidst cries of, and it's got it in Japanese, a fleet of 20 or more boats filled with men and harpoons, ropes, and floats would set forth. He had heard many stories about bringing in whales, but in his part of Shikoku, it had happened only twice in his memory. How wonderful had it been. Everyone in his village and nearby villages, perhaps in the whole province of Tosa, had been excited and happy. The tantalizing smell of steaks cooking over a charcoal fire. Menjiro gritted his teeth and wiped his hand across his mouth. He must stop thinking of food. The Kujiro were leaving. Good. He would not tell the others about the sighting. It would only make them sad. It would only make their stomachs rumble and spasm as his did now. 10 days later, when Menjiro forced himself to walk what now seemed a long way between the cave and the lookout point, he saw a speck far out on the water. A ship! But perhaps only wished it to be a ship. Perhaps his imagination was trying to keep him from falling into the despair that has claimed his friends. Using his hand as a shade over his eyes, he gazed at the speck. It was moving. It was a ship. He walked as fast as he could back toward the cave and saw Gomen and Tormund coming out of it. A ship, he called. Come quickly. Gomen and Tormund were so weak that they walked with effort, but they came. When they were there, looking out to sea, Gomen shook his head. I don't see anything. Look, Menjiro said. Do you see it now? It is coming this way. It is a ship, Gomen said. You can see its sails. The ship turned in another direction and began to move away from them. Tormund said, it can't be helped, in Japanese. Menjiro sat with his back straight, the sole of his left foot against his inner right thigh, his hands resting on his knees. Waiting, he thought only of not thinking. All was in Buddha's hands. Tormund and Gomen stayed with him. Near soon, the ship turned and came toward them again. And he whispers something, I don't know the words, Agartaya, Argataya. Menjiro whispered in thanksgiving. He stood, took the signal flag from his rock-wedged anchor, and began waving it, like the cover of the book. Rescue, chapter 6. The ship stopped and lowered 2 boats. Barbarians, Tormund said in a low voice when the boats were close enough that they could see his occupants. 3 are light-skinned and 1 is dark. Menjiro recalled the wise man's reference to the barbarians as blue-eyed sons of pigs, and his saying that they had hairy faces. He could not tell the color of their eyes from here, but one of them had a great deal of hair on his face. A shiver ran down Menjiro's spine. These men might kill them, but without further hesitation, he left the high point with its steep drop to the sea and started walking toward a gentler slope. Surely no death could be worse than the one they faced on this island. When he reached the water's edge, he jumped in, swam to the nearest boat, and climbed in, bowing and thanking the men. Vaguely, he realized that they were staring at him in open-mouthed astonishment. When he looked fully at them, he saw that the 2 did indeed have blue eyes, so these are white people, right? Albeit different shades of blue, like white, like we are, like, I guess, I don't know if you'd say Japanese, but anyways, they look very different, right, from him. But one of the light-skinned men had brown eyes, and the dark-skinned man's eyes were also brown. Tormund and Gomen clambered into the boat, thanking the rescuers, and telling about being caught in a storm. The sailors, Menjiro realized, understood nothing they said. What if they rowed away without also rescuing Fudonojo and Jisuke? He gestured toward the island, pointed at his foot, and mimicked a limp, and then started climbing out of the boat. With his own gestures, the bearded man indicated that he understood and asked where they could get the boats into shore near the others. Tormund directed them to a point not far from the cave, but since Menjiro was the ablest of the 3, he got out of the boat to lead the way to the cave. 2 sailors stayed, 1 in each boat. The other 2, one of the light-skinned men and the dark-skinned man, both of whom looked like giants when they stood up, followed Menjiro. In response to his call, Fudonojo came out of the cave. Then Jisuke came out and began crawling toward the boats. The dark-skinned man picked Jisuke up in his arms and carried him. Menjiro gasped when the boats drew close to the ship. It was enormous, a 3-masted ship with many sails. Its flag had red and white stripes and stars in one corner. So that indicates Americans, right? When they were on deck, Manjiro, shivering convulsively from fear and overexertion, immediately decided which of the men was master of the ship. Not only his clothing, but his demeanor marked the fair-skinned man with the strong jaw as the captain. But the master of the ship was not looking at him. He was looking at Fudonoju, the only member of their group still standing. Toraman, Jasuke, and Gomen had dropped to the deck and prostrated themselves before the ship's captain in a bow. Fudonoju bowed and thanked the ship's captain and said in a clear voice that they were from the province of Tosa and their boat had been wrecked in a storm. For a fleeting moment, Manjiro resented Fudonoju's action. He, Manjiro, had been taking care of them all these past few weeks. He had been the leader. And the next instant, he sank to the deck just before Fudonoju swayed and two sailors reached out to support him. Manjiro trembled. In his pride and conceit, he had wanted recognition, and he would have done a terrible thing. Even from the time he was a child, he had known the rule of the sea and that captains addressed each other. He would have shamed Fudonoju and himself. The ship's master spoke with a firm, commanding voice, and when Manjiro glanced up, he understood that he and his friends were being told to rise. They were each given a half cup of water. With his eyes, Manjiro asked the captain for more, but he shook his head and spoke to some of the sailors, who picked up the castaways, put them across their shoulders, carried them down to a room, and placed them on a bench beside a table. Manjiro's feet did not reach the floor. It was a torturous position. His heart thumping wildly, he lowered his head and sat, wondering what the barbarians intended to do with them. Barbarians were supposedly simple-minded, but perhaps they were not as simple-minded as his countrymen thought they were. And these were just reputations they had of Americans, right? Perhaps they devised a clever and cruel method of torture. He could smell food, but they had not given any. He could not stop a humiliating drooling. The aroma became stronger. Manjiro looked up. They were not being tortured. A man was bringing food to them. But surely they were not to eat here with their feet dangling above the floor. Yes, that was the intent. Evidently, these people ate in this miserable position. Manjiro's pounding heart quieted, right? Because they sit on the floor eating. The sailor brought dishes of steaming sweet potatoes. The barbarians must eat with these strange-looking tools that another man had placed beside their bowls. Manjiro picked them up in one hand and tried to make them work together to lift a bite of sweet potatoes. The sailor who had brought the utensils took them from his hand and laid one of them aside, then demonstrated how to eat the potatoes with the other one, the one with the prongs. So that's a fork. Ah, like a shovel, Manjiro thought, for the spoon. It worked well, and he had never tasted anything more delicious than these sweet potatoes. The bowls were taken away, but he was still hungry. He knew the others were too. So this was it. These men knew they were suffering terribly for want of water and food. First, the barbarians gave their wretched victims only a half cup of water. Then they teased with only a portion of the food a starving man craves. Again, Manjiro and his friends sat with their heads bowed. No one had given a sign that they could rise. After a time, the man who had brought the sweet potatoes came again, this time with bowls of soup. The soup reassured Manjiro. But what strange eating customs these people had. First sweet potatoes, then soup, with a long interval in between. The soup, which had chunks of meat in it, was satisfying and delicious, but Manjiro was still hungry when they were told to get up. Later, they were bidden back to the table, and this time the servers brought bowls of rice. Manjiro's eyes filled with tears. The wise men had been wrong. These people were not barbarians. They were kind, and they ate rice. Okay, then chapter 7 is called Difficult Adjustments. Hammock, a sailor said to Manjiro. The sailor closed his eyes and laid the side of his face against his folded hands. The men had strung other hammocks for Toraman and Gomen. Jasuke, because of his injured foot, was assigned a bottom bunk. Fudonoju would sleep in a spare top bunk. Manjiro was looking around the area that was evidently the sailors' home on the ship, the place where they ate and slept and did their mending, when powerful arms picked him up and put him on the hammock. In the glow of lamplight, some of the sailors smoked pipes with long, slender handles while they talked. One of the dark men had a round box that made music when he squeezed its ends together. At first, the music was merry, and then it became filled with longing. Like him, Manjiro thought these men were homesick. Beneath the closed lids, his eyes stung, and his throat ached from locked-in weeping. From the day of the storm, survival had taken precedence over all else. Now that they were safe, the longing for home, for his family and his village, and for flowers, for Nakanohama's gnarled old pine trees, and the comforting spirits of his ancestors was almost too much to bear. But he had to bear it. He didn't want their rescuers to think he was ungrateful. Besides, if he began to cry, Gomen would cry too. Manjiro took deep, even breaths. They were sailing in a light breeze. The hammock rocked gently. The pain in his chest slowly dissolved, and he felt himself sinking into sleep. He awakened more than once before morning. The lamps that hung here and there, he realized, were always alit during dark hours. Some men would leave, yawning and stretching and mumbling, and another group would come in, because they're replacing the sailors, right? Manjiro thought almost longingly about the silent darkness of the cave. The next day, when he and his Tosa friends were alone, Fudonoju said, I had a reason for telling the captain only that we are from the province of Tosa. I suspect that means nothing to him. We must not speak the name of our country. Manjiro understood the wisdom of Fudonoju's instructions. Even if the men on the ship were not barbarians, they were not Chinese, and they surely were not Dutch. The wise old man had said all Dutchmen were fat. Therefore, the men of his ship must be from a country that was an enemy to Dai Nippon, which is the name of where they are. A week had passed since their rescue, and they had been well treated, but Manjiro didn't think he had ever been more miserable. Standing on the forecastle deck with Gomen and Tormund and Fudenoju, he squirmed and grimaced. The captain is generous, Fudenoju said. They had been given sea chests for their ragged clothing and provided with clothes like the sailors wore. Manjiro knew Fudenoju didn't right to mention the generosity, but the clothing was so uncomfortable that his mood had turned sour. The checked shirt was not bad, but nothing good could be said of the pants and footwear. The pants flared out below the knee, but were so tight across the buttocks and thighs that one could not squat or sit in the comfortable half-lotus position. They sit kind of on the backs of their legs. The shoes were worse. They were devices of torture. Manjiro shifted from one foot to another. These people, he said, must be strong to bear such pain without complaint. Yes, Gomen said, I almost envy Jasuke. He only had to wear one of the miserable shoes. Never before did I so appreciate the joy of bare feet or straw sandals. Tormund gave one of his slightly mocking grins. Are these the same two who a few days ago constantly spoke of their gratitude to their rescuers? Manjiro looked down at the deck. Toramon was right. He and Gomen should be ashamed. We are forever in the Mr. Aiken's debt for what he has done for Jasuke, he said. Mr. Aiken, the chief mate, had applied medicine, then plaster and bandages to Jasuke's injured foot. When Gomen did not take the opportunity to unburden his spirit of the critical words he had spoken about their benefactors, Manjiro added, and I'm sure Gomen agrees that Mr. Roston was very kind to cut our hair and loan us scissors to cut our toenails and fingernails. Mr. Roston, who made barrels for some purpose, had also shaved off Fudenoju's long, ragged goatee. Yes, that was most kind, Gomen said a bit sullenly. Like Mr. Roston, Manjiro thought, all the sailors seemed to have more than one skill. For instance, every man of the crew took a turn at the wheel, which meant that all knew how to steer the big ship. When they were working, they did not talk much, but when they were not on duty, they used many more words than Nihonjin did. Even when one's feelings about something could be conveyed with a look or a grunt, the sailors chose to speak. Sometimes two men would speak to each other with angry voices, and once two sailors, not much older than Gomen, had bloodied each other with their fists. Manjiro had been watching them and had been greatly startled when Captain Whitfield himself shouted from the elevated deck where he walked, Avast, Jerry McKay! Avast, Cliff Wixon! The fighting had immediately stopped. Fighters and onlookers had silently gone their separate ways. Surely the captain of a great ship was like a lord, Manjiro thought. Why had he stopped the fight himself instead of asking one of those who served him to do so? Why had the men not been punished? And, strangest of all, how was it the next day the two who had been fighting were talking together? Manjiro moved his eyes from the bottom to the top of the rigging. And I'm going to pause there, and I will finish this in a separate video.